Okay, that's recording. And I'll just tidy up this screen a little bit for the folks at home. I don't actually know how to make that go away. Okay, hopefully there's nothing too important at the very top of the slide here. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be back in New South Wales. I'm actually born and bred in Nambucca Heads up the north coast, but haven't managed to head down here for about a decade. So great to be in Sydney. I'm a Queensland-based researcher. As Tom mentioned, I've started my PhD at the University of Queensland on this species here, the red goshawk. However, I am fortunate that it was a pre-existing project that I've come on as the PhD student. So I've actually got some data to share and talk about, which is always nice because I'm only a year and a half into the PhD. And when you're dealing with these rare species, those PhDs tend to drag out. So I'm looking at about 5 years or so. Suppose I'll just click next with the mouse. So first I thought I'd just start off with why are we doing this research? So for those of you who don't know, the red goshawk is arguably considered Australia's rarest bird of prey and possibly our most imperiled. That's something I'll elaborate on as we get through this talk. They're little studied and poorly understood, and their population has undergone a significant decline, and it's not a historical decline. It's actually been some local regional extinctions in the last 10 to 20 years. And we don't know why that's occurred or the true extent of that decline. We do not know if the remaining populations are secure, principally across Northern Australia, which is now the only place that we can find breeding pairs or a breeding population of this species, which once ranged as far south as where we are today, Sydney. And so understanding and managing this species can have a disproportionate benefit for other threatened species because it's a very effective umbrella species, the red goshawk. So in the last 200 years, due to recent meta-analysis, the red goshawk has lost over 50% of its habitat in the last 200 years. And what's remaining is really fragmented and possibly too thick. That's something I've added in there because that's one of the key hypotheses we have is that where there is remaining habitat within its southeast range, due to the absence of fire, it's actually become too thick for what is essentially a long-winged forest-dwelling hawk. So this is a paper that's due to come out later this year that I'm a co-author on with Michelle Ward, and she's looked at all the threatened species across Australia and tried to quantify that habitat loss since European settlement. A couple of flagship species you can see there, such as the golden-shouldered parrot has lost 96% of its habitat. The glossy black cockatoo from the subspecies from the Kangaroo Island has lost 97%. And those are range restricted species. So if you want to talk about scale, the red goshawk's lost 57% of its habitat, but it encompasses basically eastern and northern Australia. As a result of that, the mean patch size and density of patch fragments has also increased. And what that has resulted in is the red goshawk's conservation status is now critically endangered in New South Wales, whilst most people actually believe the species is what they call functionally extinct, meaning really there's 0 or maybe 1 pair hanging on here. As we head further north, the species is endangered in Queensland, vulnerable in the NT and WA, where it extends until very recently just to the Kimberley. And on a national level, it's also classified as vulnerable. So managing red goshawk populations, as I alluded to, could benefit a high number of other threatened species. And that's from another recent study by Michelle Ward, where she quantified the co-benefit of managing an optimised list of Australia's threatened species, priority species. The top row shows the Australian government's list and the co-benefits for those species, and then the optimised list down the bottom. And as you can see, the red goshawk is in the top 7. So if you manage red goshawks, then it's going to benefit 4.5 other threatened species. So it's what you would call an umbrella species because it umbrellas other threatened species. So I think we'll just, I'll give you guys a bit of a background and go into the taxonomy and morphology of the species, and then a little bit of the biology, ecology, and then get into the research basically. So it's in the Accipitidae family with the other hawks, eagles, kites, etc. But within the genus Erythrotriorchis, it shares that with just one other species, another very poorly known species from New Guinea called the chestnut-shouldered goshawk. And formerly it shared with another New Guinean species, the Doria's goshawk, but that's now been split into Megatriorchis. At times, it's been classified as the radiated falcon. That was by Latham in 1801. Then Haliaetus calei, which is a sea eagle. I don't know what the story is behind that. Sparvius radiatus in 1844. Astur testaceus by Kaup in 1847. Astur radiatus by Gould in 1865. And then finally Erythrotriorchis radiatus, the red goshawk by Sharp in 1875. So what I wanted to allude to with that list is that it's kind of a weird bird. It's bits of a harrier and a hawk and a goshawk. And so I think the taxonomists have had trouble with this bird for some time. It was once thought to be part of an old Australasian endemic order, which would include the square-tailed kite and the black-breasted buzzard. However, that's now unsupported through DNA testing. We know that those two guys are related. They're actually a pernine kite, but the red goshawk is not. It's considered to be part of a rich offshoot of the Indonesian and Papuan accipiter radiation. So essentially, I think we've gone full circle and it is considered an accipiter, just a very large, kind of weird one, which I'll explain why when we look at its morphology. And what DNA evidence has shown more recently is that the accipiter and the circus genus are allied through common ancestry, which you can see in the top right there with the accipiter complex, the circus complex. And I think some early authors actually alluded to that linkage by looking at the red goshawk because it does kind of have a harrier bill and head. So let's talk about that morphology. So the middle toe is actually more, relatively speaking, elongated like the sparrowhawks, more so than the other goshawks. But then strangely, other aspects of its morphology is more closely like the true hawks from the Buteo genus. And to help explain that, we can look at some of the tail to wing length ratios. So the northern goshawk, it has the tail to wing length ratio is 0.71. So that's a relatively shorter winged, longer tailed, typical, as you think of it, goshawk that maneuvers through the forest, good for short but powerful bursts of flight, but not sustained soaring flight like the other hawks. And the type specimen for the accipiter genus, the Eurasian sparrowhawk, very similar ratios there at 0.72. So more of the typical, it just looks like it could be a juvenile brown goshawk that there, you know, the short, broad, powerful wings, longer sort of tail. Then we look at the soaring hawks, or in this case, the common buzzard, Buteo buteo, it's 0.53. And then the little eagle, 0.54. Species that have an ecology that involves more soaring, more open country. And so when we look at the red goshawk, it's 0.60. So it's kind of in between the true hawks out in the open country and then your forest dwelling goshawks that might hunt through beneath the canopy of your woodlands and your forests. So it kind of stands out in that regard. One of the most interesting things about this species is its extreme level of reverse size sexual dimorphism. Reverse being the female is larger than the male, which is true of all diurnal raptors, and size dimorphism because we can also have
females larger than the male.
It's abbreviated to RSSD. But to look at that photo there, that's from the Tiwi Islands, and that's probably the best example I've seen of the scale of that difference.
UCL,
On the left, you've got the mature breeding female. As you can tell by the white on her belly, the really bold streaking, the lighter coloured head, yellow feet, which doesn't quite see out well in that photo. Yep. And then on the right is actually a juvenile, so that would be her young. However, it's clearly a fledgling, and you would expect it to be basically adult size. So that's the kind of difference. They're both on the same perch, so you think field of view's not messing that photo up too much. So it's a huge difference. And I decided to sort of look into that because it's just one of those phrases, you know, it's one of the most dimorphic birds in the world. And I found this table from the North American species from a landmark study in this by Snyder and Wiley in 1976. And I've highlighted there the most dimorphic species that they have there in North America based on the female to male body mass percentage. So the sharp-shinned hawk, the female is 175% the size of her male equivalent in that species. That's the largest among there. Some other notable ones being a gear falcon, peregrine falcon at 150 and 156 respectively. Harriers, again, remember that relationship between them, the accipiters and the harriers, 152. And so then I decided to look into the red goshawk. Now, the trouble is with such a poorly known and data poor species, we'd only ever weighed two birds, two male birds. Good luck. So that was what the first guy weighed 640 grams. The second guy weighed 630 grams. So the average weight is 635 grams. and don't get me wrong, that's compared to the female weights, that was still quite a high degree of dimorphism. However, fortunately, in this last field season, we managed to catch a couple of our first males and weigh them and add some data to this. And as you can see, the minimum value there is 510. So we actually got a male that weighed just 510 grams. We also got a second male that weighed 567 grams. So it's starting to appear that they're actually even more dimorphic than we first thought. We've also been weighing the females. There's a little bit more data historically on the females. Particularly, you see that maximum weight of 1370 grams. That's from a Southeast Queensland bird, the specimen a day. I've not encountered a bird that heavy yet, but I have got one from the tropics that was 1205 grams. And that's down to a minimum value of 986 grams. That's the lightest female we've managed to catch. And so the mean value for those sexes is, as you can see there, 587 and 1145. And when you run the numbers on that, it's a female relative to male body mass percentage of 185%. So she's basically on average 2 times his size.
2 times.
Yeah, wow. Quite a bit larger than even the sharp-shinned hawk. So, I think it'd be really cool. Somebody's got their microphone.
Why that is?
Oh, sure.
For a reason.
Hello, folks at home. Has anyone got their microphone on? Can you hit mute on that? If I use this laptop, I'm the host. I don't know if I can forcibly mute people though. I don't hear any background noise now. I think they're probably onto it. Yeah, so it's a crazy difference in size. Funnily enough, though, you think you'd go into the field and be able to recognise male from female immediately, and I can tell you don't. Particularly with the juveniles when they're all the same rufous plumage and lightly coloured legs. Or maybe I'm just a terrible birder. Biology and ecology. So they're a bird eater. And I should mention the trend globally with that reverse size sexual dimorphism is that it's highest in the bird eaters for whatever reason, we don't know. So yeah, the one published study on this species diet, it was 98.8% birds, and that's for at least in the tropics, the NT and Kimberley, where they were studied in the 80s. They're a live prey specialist, so there's been no records of pirating or scavenging. They will rob nests of young, however. And that's the table there from really what is the landmark foundational sort of study for this species, and everything that I reference, my Bible, Tom Orman and David Baker Gabb did a study on the species in 91. So as you can see in the top right there, mammals constituted 0.02% of their diet. I think they found one flying fox remains, so still a flying species. And what stands out to me there is that pisciforms, the parrots, comprise 50% of their diet. As you can see, the lorikeets, both red-collared, being this study coming from the NT and Kimberley, and varied lorikeets comprised a high proportion of their diet. However, they will take things as large as red-tailed black cockatoos, and from my own experience, they will take sulphur-crested cockatoos also. And there was a slight uptick. Just to explain, this is the pre-laying incubation period, the nestling, end for nestling period, and the post-fledgling period. So they wanted to see if there was any differences throughout the breeding phases to perhaps indicate differential hunting between males and females. Statistically, nothing sort of came out, but you can definitely notice red-tailed black cockatoos. Where is it? Oh no, I take that back. It was 39%, 33 and 24. So perhaps the male, even more intriguing, perhaps the male is actually capable of taking down prey of that size, which would almost certainly be the equivalent of his weight, if not double the size. I've been collecting some diet samples and pellets, prey remains, anything I find really myself, to build on this study, but also just to collect some Queensland data on the Queensland birds. It's not a core part of my PhD, but whilst you're out and have these opportunities, you should collect such information. So that's just a typical collection from a nest. And in that one photo there is the remains of 7 red-collared lorikeets. So it's really high on their list for preferred prey. The kookaburras feature heavily. Anecdotally, they seem to feature more heavily than the data in that published study would suggest. I seem to find a lot of kookaburra remains, blue-winged kookaburras, and then every now and then, since I'm collecting new data on the Queensland diets, you'll get the equivalent. So a laughing kookaburra will pop up, rainbow lorikeet versus red-collared lorikeet. On Cape York, there's not too many red-tailed black cockatoos compared to, say, the dry country of Kakadu. So they will take a lot of sulphur-crested cockatoos, which you can see there, which really is just impressive prey to take. That's a risky species for them to tackle. One bite through their leg from that beak, and that's fatal for them. Just another cool thing I've been playing around with is, when I find a new skull like this, like I could tell it looked like a pisciform, but it was smaller, and I wasn't sure of the species, and I thought I could see a little feather, and then under the scope you can see that's a red feather, and the lorikeets have blue heads, so that was a varied lorikeet feather remains. So that's just a sort of side thing that I'm hoping to collect, and perhaps see if there's any changes in the prey base. So they're said to require large tracts of intact habitat, possibly due to their requirements for large home ranges. They breed in proximity to water. It was thought that the initial findings were they invariably nested within 1 kilometre of water, in fact, permanent water. I've since found nests that debunk that, and so we're going to have to update the survey guidelines, but they do seem to be within proximity of water, whether it be a couple Ks or up to 3 Ks. They're said to be what's called a K-selected breeder compared to an R-selected breeder, and basically that's characterised. They have a low output of young. They're not like a kestrel or a falcon that can, in good conditions, spit out 4 young, for example. They only have 1 or 2 young, but the offshoot of that is that it's expected to have higher survival than those species that have higher fecundity. That's a couple of male juveniles from Cape York. And if you can see on the branch there, that's the remains of a sulphur-crested cockatoo they were feeding on. Oh, I didn't update my header there. So basically I've found there's really two classes of habitat. And I prefix that by the fact that I and no one else in this day and age is able to find red goshawks anywhere but Northern Australia. So this is very much a Northern Australia study. And it comes down to riparian and woodland. So the riparian sites are typically further inland in more rangeland country where their breeding is restricted to the watercourses, which supports the taller trees and probably the higher prey base. So this is an example of a woodland nest, big tall melaleucas. It's a little hard to tell because I've zoomed in there, but these are like 35-metre high melaleucas, weeping paperbark melaleuca leucodendron. That's the nest there. And it's a really messy, shaggy sort of structure. One of the key things that people say when you're looking for a red goshawk nest is that the thickness of the sticks. They're like thumb size, generally, thicker than your brown goshawk, your sparrowhawk. Less likely to be in dead trees and right close to water, such as with your buzzards. But what I'm now noticing, finding a couple of these riparian sites, is that it is to a degree largely just an artifact of what's available in the environment. I wouldn't call those sticks, largely they're quite thin sort of sticks. On the base, there's some larger ones, but when I show you what I mean by a woodland site, and so those sites are as yet exclusively in the Darwin stringy bark, Eucalyptus tetradona, savanna woodlands of Northern Australia, principally places where they're structurally, the best, the tallest, such as Western Cape York Peninsula, the really top end of the NT. The further north you get, the better it gets. Places like Maningrida, Coburg Peninsula, Mitchell Plateau in the Kimberley. That's really seems to be the best stuff for red goshawk. A typical site sort of looks like that. In fact, I'd even say that's a little bit more stunted, that site. There's the nest there, but it's a dry woodland site, and you can often tell you're in the right spot by the colour of the termite mud, that rich red termite mud that you're up on a plateau, as opposed to the sort of yellow and pale muds further towards the riparian zone. And that's the thick sort of thumb-sized sticks that I'm alluding to. I should also note that their nest placement is another key characteristic or diagnostic. They will not nest, except in a few cases where the supporting limb of the original nest snaps off and then they nest on the trunk. But other than that, 99% of the nests I've found, it's out on a major limb where it will fork out, and they'll place their nest in that fork. That's a key feature of the red goshawk nest. But like I said, I've now found two examples where that limb has snapped. They've wanted to continue using the site, and so they've placed their nest on the top of the trunk. So you can't always dismiss it by placement. Let's get a little bit into status and distribution, which includes some of the findings I've had, or very preliminary findings. But first, I'd like to do a bit of a background, particularly on the history, because since we are here in Sydney. So as I said earlier, the red goshawk was first described by Latham in 1801, and it was based off that painting there. That was a painting by a gentleman called the Port Jackson painter, somewhere between 1788 and 1796. So Latham never actually saw a skin of a bird. It was just a painting of a bird that he then replicated and named the species of. And there's an interesting story behind it. So quote unquote, the skin of this bird I found nailed up to a settler's hut. It is the only one of the kind ever seen. The drawing is a faithful copy. The settler who shot it says the iris was brown and remarked that he never saw any bird fly with such swiftness. Its claws were long and sharp. When he took it up, it drove quite through the end of his finger, a new falcon. So the bird was nailed to the side of a hut in an early settler in the Sydney region. That was the type for red goshawk. Steve Davis actually reviewed it and he identified it as a juvenile based on the plumage. The next the first specimen came some years later, around 1800 to 1810, by George Cayley. We don't know the exact location, but we know it was within 150 kilometres of Sydney. That's it there. It's now in the British Museum of Natural History. Steve Debus reviewed it and identified it as an immature, possibly second-year bird. And just to show you why he would have said that, it's the paleness of the breast. So that bird's much more rufous, still got a little bit of light. The head is lightening up a little bit compared to that mature breeding female on the right, much more pale. So that's why he said an immature, possibly second-year bird, not a full juvenile. What's important about that is that there's been no other records really around Sydney since, and they're both juveniles, which indicates perhaps the breeding range extended as far as the historical range, right to here. Later, the specimens came from the Clarence and Manning Rivers districts in the 1840s by Gould and his collectors. There was an adult male collected by E.P. Ramsey near Grafton in 1867. And then breeding, in terms of verified breeding records, that I could find was as far south as the Richmond Valley, up in northern New South Wales, eggs collected early last century. So they were throughout New South Wales, they were a breeding population, and sadly, we now think they're gone. Specimens were also collected throughout coastal and near coastal Queensland and MT throughout the next couple of centuries post-settlement. And then at the far end of their distribution, which ended up in the Kimberley, adult females were collected in the Napier Broome Bay, and a juvenile was actually collected just near Broome. That's pretty much where the distribution map ceases. That's currently their distribution according to BirdLife International, and current because as you can see, it once went as far south as Sydney. But I just want to highlight a couple areas that makes me question things, at least, and in terms of our understanding of their distribution. You might be wondering, what the hell is that doing in the middle there? Is there just some small population of red goshawks persisting in the McDonnell Ranges of Central Australia? So what makes it really interesting, eggs were collected in that range near Alice Springs in the late 1800s, and in 1923 by a fellow named Whitlock, who was out there looking for night parrots. They've been dismissed as little eagle eggs for more than a century, and at this stage, rightly so. However, Tom Orman in the mid-90s, the chap who did that landmark study on the red goshawk, was down there doing his PhD on raptor assemblages in the riparian zones, and he encountered red goshawks on 3 occasions. And that was the first verified sightings of the species in Central Australia. So then it sort of made everyone take a look at those eggs again. So the question remains, could they possibly have bred that far inland? Now, the trouble is we can't really tell by traditional measurements the difference between little eagle eggs and red goshawk eggs. So the top row of eggs you can see in that photo there are little eagles, and the bottom one is red goshawk, very similar. However, what we're hoping to do now is use some 3D scanning technologies to see if there's any different metrics we can use to separate the species. And if that doesn't work, we can use something a little bit more invasive, such as drilling a small hole into these, getting a powder sample, and they can tell you what species it's derived from. You may have heard recently that some researchers at CSIRO did this to verify if some late specimens were paradise parrot, but they were not. Next, I want to just talk a little bit about this area of Western New South Wales. So there was a specimen that purportedly came from Burke. It was lost. And so again, it has been dismissed as it was just too far inland, couldn't have been red goshawk. But then I managed to locate records of 2 clutches of eggs that were collected from the Macquarie Marshes in the 1950s by a chap named Len Harvey. He actually had prior experience with red goshawk. He'd collected eggs at Clermont. And so we have no reason to say that he would have misidentified the species. Still, it's 500 k's from the coast and much further inland than any other contemporary breeding records. So that's one, again, we'd like to sample the eggs and perhaps, totally redraw our understanding of their distribution, breeding or otherwise. And lastly, there's a little area over there on the Pilbara, well outside their known distribution. In fact, it's over 500 k's from the nearest other observation. But why am I pointing out that? Well, the first ever Pilbara record was uncovered in June of 2019 with that photo right there. A gentleman named Lester Trotter, who's travelling around Australia, a grey nomad, is not particularly a birder, just into his photography, took that photo of that bird and posted it on Facebook, and it's the first record for the species. It's a mature, what's really interesting is it's a mature female. She was hunting along the Road River and it was taken in June. Now, based on the birds that we have tracked and our knowledge of their breeding seasonality, I would expect that female to be on her breeding territory by June because they typically lay eggs July, August. So she should be well into all the pre-laying courtship phase of the breeding cycle. So that begs the question, has there been this undetected breeding population of red goshawks in the Pilbara that we've only just uncovered, or is she a migrant from further north? So I'll just go through now some of the data I've sort of been crunching and trying to get a handle on what's going on with their distribution and try and quantify their decline a little bit. So I've sourced records from all these databases. It's probably a bit of overkill, but the intent was to just get every possible independent record of red goshawk, since they are a data poor species. So eBird, ALA, the Field Atlas projects, Bird Data, the recovery team has its own records, state governments, etc. They produce over 2,500 records, which is quite a bit really. But once you start looking into it, I've realized there's a lot of duplication. You know, ALA gets its records from eBird, government databases, a lot of sharing. And so I still need to really now get into it and filter it out and just get what are the truly unique independent records. But it's still okay right now for spatial analysis because we're not trying to look at reporting rates or anything like that, just where they were. And if all the dots overlap on the map, then it doesn't really matter. Now, contemporary records are the other problem. They're heavily biased to just the same few nest sites. So if I was to plot red goshawk observations through time on eBird, the curve is like this. You would think that red goshawks are just going great, you know, but when I hone in on that year, say 2020 or 2019, 90% of them come from just a couple nest sites. So I might try a little exercise here, see how it goes. Can anyone raise their hand if they've seen a red goshawk? Oh, that's quite a bit. All right, now keep your hand raised. I want you to lower your hand if you saw that red goshawk on the Lilyvale Road on Cape York Peninsula near the Musgrave Roadhouse or the Lotus Bird Lodge. No? Okay. There's a nest on the Lilyvale Road. You you head up the Cape, you chuck a ride the Musgrave Roadhouse as you head into Lakefield. The Lotus Bird Lodge is right there. We've got some unshores or? Okay, so keep your hand raised if that's not where you saw a red goshawk. Violet Vale. Violet Vale or Lily Vale. The Vales, yeah, there's a few Vales around there. The road's called Lilyvale Road. I'd say that's the same one. Yeah, they're quite close. I'm not sure which station it's actually positioned on. It's the Lilyvale Road. Yeah, just close to the load. Like, yep. Yep. They've been breeding there for a few years. So that's the main nest site that everyone's seen them, at least in Queensland. Okay, so lower your hand if you saw them at Mataranka near the Bitter Springs Caravan Park. Early 2000s, early 2010s. Okay, this could be really fruitful for me because you might know nests I've never found. Lower your hand if you saw them in Kakadu on the Kakadu Highway near the Mary River Ranger Base. These are all nests I'm referring to. Okay, then please, you 4, 5 people, 6 people, where did you see red goshawk?
Well, I've got to keep it up because I've only seen it at the Lotus Bird Lodge.
At the lodge, like in the lodge? Oh, cool. So it wasn't at a nest?
Sorry,
It wasn't at
there was a chick with it.
on a nest, or they were flying around? I'm going to say it's the Lilyvale Road nest. I'd be pretty confident of that. What about you guys? Is there any like sightings of just going out into the bush and happening upon a red goshawk? That's a good record. I'd like to talk to you about that. There's been none coming out of Central Queensland for quite some time. That'd be great. Yeah.
2006, George Swan,
Ah, yes.
and it was somewhere between Belford or somewhere like that.
Yep. Along a road or close to a road, a dirt track. Did he say he found it in the mid-90s and he's been going there for years? Oh, very good. I know George. I've got George's record, so it'd be cool to know where that was. There's other people up the back who had. Oh, yep. Nice, nice. So not a nest. Ah, that's awesome. I'm yet to just find one out in the bush. It's everything's centered around nest sites for me.
I saw one study
Shakira. How long ago? That's awesome. Yeah. So that. Yeah. 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 So his surveys in Southeast Queensland and follow-up surveys by my supervisor, Richard Seaton. It's the basis for our understanding of these regional declines / extinctions. So then now we think they're gone from Southeast Queensland. And yet, what was that, 15 years ago, 20 years ago? Like it's not that long ago that they were there. Did I get everyone? Yeah, yep. Yep. They are. They've last 2 years their breeding's failed. Both found dead chicks on the ground. So we don't know what's going on there. If there's just inexperienced pair, because that nest has been there for years. So surely there's been turnover of different adults and stuff like that. But yeah, unfortunately they haven't successfully bred for a couple of years. Hopefully they will this year. Well, hopefully they'll stay there in the territory. Yeah. But I want to talk to the fellow at the back there about that Rockhampton siren. That'd be a good one if you don't mind. So in terms of the data, because think about this, you've got just dots on the map and it won't say nothing else. And you've got to decipher, do I accept that? Do I reject that? What do I do with that? But where it has something to go off, some comments on the description of the species, photos, specimens, obviously, that's gold for us. But in that database, only 4.5% actually had some sort of description as to what the person saw. 4.8 had associated media, so it could be acoustic recording of their call at a nest or photos, largely, photos are the best. And 1.4% of the records were specimens. Those are not mutually exclusive. So it was about 4% of the records had anything that I could sort of do with the data to try and make some inferences. So what I thought I'd do is, everything suggests there's this northward contraction, that the species is losing its range northward up to now Northern Australia. And so to help me sort of base some decisions on my analysis to compare southern versus northern populations, I thought I've got to delineate a line. Where do I put that line? You know, are they still hanging around in Rockhampton, or are they now only in Cape York Peninsula? So I thought I'd plot all the nests of the last, well, since the 80s, and then any of those records that had media that I could verify. That's what I spat out. So I delineated north versus south at around 18 degrees latitude, which came out around sort of Cairns region. And then I analysed the data. And I'm chiefly looking at, just spatially looking at distribution, so area of occupancy. And just, this is just built off the field atlases, 1 degree grid cells. So I can compare it with that data. That would be right, southern, right there, those records. That's Cape Princess Charlotte Bay. Cohen's around here. So the Peninsula Development Road runs like this. Princess Charlotte Bay, Lakefield National Park, Cohen, Musgrave Roadhouse. You'd want to come up here, chuck a right, Lilyvale Road, there's the nest, there's Lowsburg Lodge. Right there too. Yep, it's all in that one area. It's a great day birding. You get golden shouldered parrots, red goshawk, starfinch, black-throated finch. It's really good. So 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. And what the data showed, green is north, red is south, is it kind of teased out what we've all seen and what everyone's talking about this decline of the red goshawk. You can see, in fact, an increase in birds, the area of occupancy across the north. That's really just because detection has increased. More people are able to go up there, get around, go birding. We know of nests, whereas I'm told sort of before the cuppers found and photographed their nests, you just couldn't find them. Whereas the real stronghold for the species, if you go back a few years, like look at the southeast, northern New South Wales, southeast Queensland, it's starting to thin out, you know, and you can see that in the trend. It's really starting to dip, but that's actually not as severe as I think the situation is. This is just the raw data. So this is unvetted data, everything thrown in there, what's it look like sort of thing. And that's still teasing out that trend. So I thought I need to vet this data. So what sort of process can I go by? Keeping in mind there's only 4% of records with any sort of information. Stage one, would accept if it's part of its targeted survey, such as with Greg Shakura. You've got experienced observers, reviewed by experts. There's a detailed description. It's got verified media. Or I took the step in this instance of accepting all the birds across the north of 80 degrees latitude, because I know if I form a bounding box in that area, I've got nests that encompass the whole area. So they're still there. They're still, red goshawks are there. Unless there's anything obvious that suggests the record's incorrect. They don't go to New Guinea. No. Stage two, records in time and space where presence can justifiably be expected based on these surveys, these observations. So Southeast Queensland to about the 2000s, then they really start to dip out. And so I'm going to investigate those records a little closer than I would have in 1990s when Greg Shakura was finding them commonly in the Sunshine Coast. New South Wales, the 90s. That builds on Steve Debus's work where he reviewed all the records up into the 90s. And then since then, it's also coincided with them dipping out in the state. Central Queensland, North Queensland, data poor areas, but still up to the 2000s, you could justifiably expect that red goshawks would be there. Then stage three, whatever was left, I chased every record down that I possibly could, getting in touch with people, birding groups, anyone that had a record in there that I could try and corroborate the evidence. And so this is now the vetted data, whereas yes, I've accepted it. Yellow, there's a couple I'm not sure they're to be determined. Red, no, I do not accept the record. And I ran the same analysis. Centre for occurrence really wasn't a great measure because we've got birds showing up in the Pilbara for the first time. That's the big polygon around all the records. It kind of skews that data. But then looking again at that area of occupancy. The trend for the south versus the north, it's really declining. But what I thought I'd do next is that, well, if you look at it from just purely a north versus south basis, this Pilbara record really kind of throws a spanner in the works. And then we've also got some of these inland records from the NT, which I really can't rule out. They look correct, but it's not capturing the decline of the species up the southeast. So I threw another line down there at 140 degrees longitude, and then broke it up into a northeast versus southeast analysis, really just trying to hone in on where we know the decline's taken place. So the northeast versus southeast analysis has showed even a more severe drop-off between north and south. So from a baseline in the 1980s of 25 occupied grid cells, we're down to 2 in the 2010s. So that's a 92% reduction in area of occupancy in the last 40 years. All right, let's get on to some fun stuff, which is the birds doing their thing and me not necessarily talking. So we've got a tracking study. It's been running since 2015, and it's taken us that long to figure out how to find this species, catch this species, refine our methods and track them remotely. Once you put a tag on this bird, you're probably never going to see it again. So we need solar power, remote communications by satellite. All these things had to be figured out. But now, dare I say it, in 2021, we're at a place that we can do this. So to date, 12 individual red goshawks have been tracked. It's broken up by 6 adults and 6 juveniles, 10 females and 2 males. We're up to 16,000 GPS locations so far accumulated and counting through all 3,627 red goshawk days. So day in the life of a red goshawk. Our method, so we use a 17-gram solar-powered GPS satellite transmitter. So it has the accuracy of a GPS, but it sends the data to us via satellite. So once we put the tag on the bird, I just download its information every few days with the satellite pass from my home in Toowoomba. It's fitted with a backpack harness, which has a cotton weak link in the front, so it should fall off, degrade naturally, and fall off after a couple of years. The tags themselves will last 2 to 3 years of data. And like I said, it's retrieved remotely. So I'll play some videos now of some of the birds' movements that we've been seeing. This is an adult female. She's a seasonal migrant. And these are her seasonal movements for the last 3 years. She comes from a remote river system north of Weipa called the Dulhunty River System, very remote nest. She migrates south. She was all over the place that year because there was a lot of cyclones. She migrates south annually to a very defined non-breeding season home range in the Gregory Ranges, the Ainslie Uplands around Richmond, Hughenden sort of way. She seems to spend the wet season down there before returning north to the breeding grounds where she's bred in the same nest, at least since 2016. So this single bird has really altered our understanding of the species quite a bit. They were thought to be year-round residents on their breeding territories. So you can imagine when we first put the tag on this bird and she just kept heading south and we didn't know when she was going to stop. It was pretty exciting. And she's also the first true migrant of the species that we've been able to document. She has a fixed breeding and a fixed non-breeding home ranges that she migrates between annually, and they're 1,000 k's apart. And I should mention, each photo that I have in these videos is of the actual bird. I think I've said all of those, but probably worth noting, she's a very productive female. She's in a good territory. She's produced 1 young every year, at least 1 young over the last 5 years. Very tall eucalypt tetradonta woodlands. She's tracked for 29 months so far, and we've got over 4,000 GPS locations. This adult female is from Litchfield National Park. She's also a seasonal migrant. That shows a little more variation. So she also heads inland to more open country, which is perhaps what the morphology of the species alluded to all along. See that movement there? She got as far south as the Tanami Desert. She returned to breed last year, had 2 chicks both years, so she's been going good. They had quite a bad drought year, and it seems to be reflected in her movements. She moved around a lot more the year prior, and so far this non-breeding season, she's gone to her home range there, seasonal home range near Top Springs, which overlaps with grey falcon. It'd be a dream day birding. See both of those species. So second confirmed migrant. Her breeding ranges are about 450 k's apart, but she has taken multiple forays. It's not just a one stop and return. So a little more variation. She's reached the Tanami Desert. The nest has been there since 2016, so if that's the same bird that's bred there the whole time, then she's occupied the territory for some years, shows high fidelity. And she's one of the ones on the watercourses. In fact, it was that nest I showed you in the paper barks. That's her nest. So far tracked for 16 months. This is the first bird we put a tracker on for my PhD, 2,000 GPS locations and counting. Now we'll take a look at some of the juveniles and what they're doing. This female's from Arakoon on Western Cape York. This is her natal dispersal and then the first year of her life. So she got as far south as the Mitchell River, which is the natural biogeographic boundary between the Cape and the Gulf Plains. She returned to within 50 k's of her nest site, her natal territory, and then she did this. Very interesting thing. She just is in the one spot. Looks a lot like a breeding female, but it's only her first year of life. So either she did breed or she tried to breed as a first year juvenile, which is very much unexpected for a species of this size and its breeding strategy as a K-selected breeder. That might suggest there's absences in the population for breeding birds, perhaps females in particular. We don't know yet. She was the largest bird we've caught so far at 1,205 grams. She survived the first year of her independence, which is very good. Birds of prey have low survival, particularly bird eaters in their first year. We're now at 14 months of tracking her and we're over 2,000 GPS locations. She's remained a resident on Cape York and she really prefers those tall woodlands near the watercourses. And this is just a couple months of data of one of the newly tagged females. She's from Mount Bundy up in the top end on the Kakadu Highway. That was actually me flying in from Toowoomba, that line that came into frame there. And we got it on the bird, and this is what she's been doing throughout the late part of the breeding season. She also fledged 2 chicks, a male and female. And then now into the wet. And so far as of February, she hasn't gone anywhere. So they don't all do these big crazy movements. Some are year-round residents, some are migrants. That's termed facultative migration in the species. So we've still got a bit to learn if that relates to habitat quality, but it's interesting either way. Year-round resident, as I mentioned, the home range appears really relatively small. Again, that could be an indicator of the quality of the territory and the habitat. She's barely moved more than 10 k's from the nest site, which largely the breeding territory is centered on the nest site. She has showed high nesting success also, 1 to 2 chicks per year since 2017 when this nest was found, but she did have a failure in 2016. She shows high site fidelity. There's been 3 different nest used in that time, but they're all within a 300-metre sort of area. They'll often shift nest sites, well, always so far as I can tell, if they have a breeding failure. But then if you buffer that area by a kilometre and do your grid searches, you're going to find 90% of them. They don't seem to move more than that. So far, 4 months of tracking and 660 GPS locations. I'll talk a little bit about breeding, and it's still early days. I've only been through two breeding seasons. But so far, we've managed to maintain 10 active nests in our sample size. That's not the same 10. It's sort of, you won't be able to find a couple, but then you find a couple new ones. But it's actually remained the same across the board in terms of where they are. We've had 5 nests in Queensland, 4 in the Northern Territory mainland, and not the Tiwi Islands, and just 1 in the Kimberley, courtesy of George Swan. Of those nests, we've managed to get to 8 and then 9 of them to determine how many produced fledglings, because as you can imagine, they fledge around October, November. If the wet season breaks early, it's hard to get to some of these nests. Of them, 7 and 5 were successful, and 8 and 7 fledglings produced respectively. And so in terms of the breeding data, I've got that early study by Tom Orman and Baker Gabb as a baseline to refer back to. And so nesting success, simply the proportion of active nests that went on to successfully fledge young, varies quite a bit. So for instance, you'll see here last year, Queensland had a shocking year, which I'm not sure why, but only 1 of the 5 nests there managed to produce young, whereas the Northern Territory in the same year had a great year and their wet season was relatively poor. So there's still different aspects we're going to have to understand about their breeding requirements to understand what drives these success rates. But all in all, there is some variation. So productivity per successful nest. So when they are successful in producing young, how many young do they produce? And it's largely 1 with the red goshawk. There's no records of, or confirmed records of them ever having three young or producing 3 eggs. Mostly it's just one chick. You'll see every now and then a nest will have a good run and they'll get 2. And so that's why your data is always sort of jumping between 1 and 1.2, 1.3, 1.5. But this is our baseline here. Those guys covered, the Northern Territory and Kimberley in the late 80s. And so we're able to build on that by covering the same sort of areas, but also adding Queensland to that. And over time, hopefully see, is the breeding stable? Are the northern populations stable? Because we've got that horrible contraction up the East Coast. And then more of a population-wide sort of assessment is productivity per active nest. So of all the birds that tried to breed, how many young was produced across the board? And that varies also. So Queensland as low as 0.20 and then up to as high as 1.5 for the various biogeographic regions. I should also mention, I've got data for the Tiwis. I'm still working on the data agreement, but I've been able to look at it and their patterns there, because they've monitored some nests over there for sort of 15 years, fits largely within these parameters. So there seems to be a lot of variation, but it's within that sort of band. Failures mostly occur at the egg and early nestling phase, which is what you would expect. It's when they're most vulnerable. However, we did find at least one fledgling, the remains of one fledgling on the right there, across the board, reasons unknown. We have no indicators as to what's driving these failures, at least at this stage. But you can see there we've got some sort of fluffy white chicks, half-grown nestlings to fledglings. But really, from what I'm seeing, mostly it's just females on the nest, but then never producing any nestlings. So could be issues with infertility. The female never got into good enough condition to produce viable eggs. Not sure. So just to recap, because I'm sure I've probably gone over time, the red goshawks have declined significantly, possibly being extirpated from over 1 million square kilometres. They're currently not classified as endangered at a national level, but I think it's only a matter of time until we show that that's warranted. Our limited state of knowledge, current state of knowledge, hampers our ability to understand the processes behind this decline, but most definitely habitat loss, habitat thickening are going to play key roles. Further research is needed. Hopefully we'll develop greater insights and be able to secure this exceptional species. I was just going to end it there and say thank you for listening, but I quickly added this slide before I got up here because I took a photo as I was flying in today, and I believe we were going over the sort of Hawkesbury, Wallamai National Park, which backs onto a bunch of other national parks, Blue Mountains, Royal National Park. There's a lot of bush down here and it looks like really tough to get through sort of bush. So I leave with the question, could they possibly still be out here? Were they resident in Sydney? Was this part of their breeding range? Are there pairs out there? Because look at all that bush. I don't know, but I'd sure like to think so. So thank you very much. Do you want me to stop the recording? Do you want me to stop the recording? Yep.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Chris. That was a very enlightening presentation.